Welcome to Men, Sex, and Tantra.
Discover what your parents, porn, and religion never taught you about being a man and having extraordinary sex. Get ready to have your mind blown and your world rocked. And we're back to Men, Sex, and Tantra, and James D with the last name that we know that I will massacre. So I'm just not going to say it. I think it's a cool James D anyway, sounds like pretty hip. So, we can roll with that, James.
I'll roll with it. I've rolled with it my whole life. So now.
Well, I always get this. People don't know me. I always get the Tanja. Tanja, because is Tanja there? I'm always like, no, she's in the Bahamas. When is she coming back? We don't know. So I usually know if somebody knows who I am because they can actually pronounce my name, not seeing that J and then losing it on that. So, that'll work. All right. So we got into a little bit about some of your background and stuff last time, but the one thing we didn't talk about is ultimately the big scene with your brother. And what I'd like to kind of focus on a little bit here is this desire that you have. The one desire you have is to also help men deal with that frustration and this idea that what happens when men is anger and all of that is going on. We know natural evolutionary, of course, they give you a lot of testosterone. That's normal. We know that testosterone not headed off in the right direction can definitely be turned inward, self-hatred, all of this kind of stuff, which can make things blow up. But give us a little background on that story about your brother and your dad, and ultimately how that might have influenced what you want to do in the world.
Absolutely. And I want to lead off by sort of talking about a snippet you gave me too, which was, I know you kind of harp on the idea that men are actually more sensitive than girls, or boys are more sensitive than girls. Yeah. You said something about how they have a 5 times higher startle reflex or something like that. And this is really interesting to me because growing up, I was the kid who was unnaturally prone to startling, to the point where my siblings would laugh. They'd be like, "Why are you so scared?" They'd come in the room and I'd freak out, if I didn't see them coming. And I think this is really interesting for what it tells us about young boys in particular, in that there's probably something going on in terms of sensory gating that we're not as good at as young girls, right? As people who are biologically female, and developing, and maybe that has something to do with that naturally higher level of testosterone, right? I would guess as much. Right, we're just kind of more prone to any kind of agitation or dysregulation or alarm, right? And perhaps that is a natural evolutionary thing where it's okay, well, we also evolved to be predators, to be hunters, to be active and dominant, and these were the kinds of early roles that we played in tribal societies, right? Hunter-gatherer type societies. So maybe that's all in accord with that. Maybe there's a special kind of there's certain natural virtues that could be lacking on the basis of testosterone being higher, being more elevated in men. Lacan, again, who I love, always talks about how the way he frames this difference between male and female is that women are naturally better at taking L's, right? Women are naturally they're better at losing and not throwing a big gigantic temper tantrum in many cases, right? Yeah. Or they're better at living the way Lacan puts it, because he has this fetish with the idea of lack and emptiness, was that women can live on the side of lack, right? Whereas men need to imagine, they're occupied by an imaginary fullness, right? Which kind of equates to men being more egotistical or more ego-driven, more accomplishment-driven, right? We imagine that we're something more than what we really are. Whereas a lot of women will have an easier time of kind of accepting their place in the order of things, right? And so that segues very well, I think, to my older brother, because before his motorcycle wreck, he was very troubled, right? And that was the reason why my parents moved us all from downtown Los Angeles to the kitschy suburbs of the Conejo Valley, Westlake Village, where all of the the affluent white people go to raise their children, right? But it's become a more inclusive community in recent years. But it's like definitely the place where like the public schools have like the token black students and stuff. But which is it's changing in a better direction, but I digress. So my older brother John, they moved, and the whole idea was, let's get him away from the gangs and the drugs and he was 12, 13 at the time that we moved. I was 6 or so. I was 13, 14. Let's get him away from the pernicious influences in the heart of the city, in Hollywood, right? And I think what they didn't count on was that unless something radically changed inside of him, and also within the sort of culture of the home, that external shift in location was not going to do anything.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So they sent him off to boarding schools, right? They sent him to, first it was the Florida Air Academy, which is run by a former Air Force veteran, or was, I think it's probably defunct by now. And, they have their marketing videos that just talk about all their tremendous success stories. And John was shortly kicked out from that place, right? I don't know exactly what he did.
Reform school. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't remember exactly what he did, but I remember when he came home and we were like changing clothes in the bedroom together for church. And I was maybe 6 or 7. He was, again, 13, 14. I remember like looking at him kind of quizzically and asking him a question. And he just punches me right in my arm, like really hard. And I remember something clicking in my head, like, something's not right with this boy. Like, I was 7 years old and he's like twice my size, and he just like socked me so hard that it bruised, right? I'm like, okay. And then so they sent him to a different boarding school. And this was the Faith Baptist boarding school in Missouri, which would soon come under all kinds of accusations and even formal indictment for child abuse, right?
Yeah.
And that place is disbanded as well. But John sort of kind of graduate in a way, I think, from them, right? And that good old Southern Baptist discipline. And I remember when he came home and he was about 16, and he had this thick Southern drawl, and my dad had just moved us to this amazing, beautiful, like 1.5 acre villa style, like, ranch house in this place, Medea Valley, which is like this, gated community in Agora Hills on the way, to the beach, to Malibu off Canyon Road. And it was like paradise. We'd arrived at paradise. John came home. He was in good spirits. He wasn't acting up. He was like the most affectionate and sweet and kind he'd ever been to me. And I was like, this was like the kind of the paradisical time in the family romance, right? Shortly thereafter, he would get back into drugs and back into trouble. He's playing football, doing his thing, but he was just consistently doing poorly in school. Whatever it was started to come back around. It hadn't been fixed. There hadn't been any kind of permanent solution here. And this would lead to him, again, being ineligible to football his senior year, and him moving away from home at the age of 19, to work up in Utah. He got into a motorcycle wreck, right? And when he came home from that wreck to sort of recover and get his bearings, I think that's when things really started to spiral downward. So given that, it was about my sophomore year of high school, and John and I had grown pretty distant because it was clear he was spiraling downwards, right? He was going out on weekend drug binges and benders and stuff, and he'd accrued maybe $100,000 in settlement money from his motorcycle wreck, and he was just spending it like hotcakes, like water, right? Just blowing through it, blowing through it. Um, he gave a portion of it to my dad to invest in the stock market. And this was right during, right before that 90s stock bubble, where my
Mhm.
dad pumped this money into all these bogus tech stocks. The portfolio just
Yeah.
tanked on the whole. And John was livid, and John was just like, give me my money back, give me my money back. So at 16 years old, I wake up one morning and my sister is walking around the house with this aluminum softball bat in her hand, just crying hysterically. And I'm like, like, what the fuck? I'm like, what is wrong with you right now, Lenore? Like, why are you crying? And she's points to the front lawn. I step out there, and John, who's about twice the size of my dad, right there in the suburbs, in this pristine neighborhood, again, where nothing like this ever happens, supposedly. He's literally tossing my dad around the front lawn. I'm 16 years old. I'm 40 pounds lighter than him and 8 years his junior and not nearly as strong. But I knew
And tossing as in violently tossing.
violently tossing. It wasn't wee, playing with a baby. No, nothing like that. So I run and get between my dad and John. And John's like, oh, you think you're so tough, blah, 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 blah. And I was able to lock up with him and to throw him down to the ground and stay on top of him. I think part of it was that he knew whatever he was up to made no sense, right? But I stayed on top of him, and then he pretended like he was, calm again, and he's laying there like, let me up, it's fine, I won't do it again, I promise. And I knew better, and I stayed on top of him and said, nope, we're gonna stay here until the cops come. You're not going nowhere. And finally, he persuaded me. As soon as I stood up, he took the fight to me, was trying to, punch, kick me, whatever, back me up against the door of the house. And the cops arrived, right? And I remember my dad just being in tears, begging with the police, please don't take my son. Please don't take him away. Let him come back to me. And I remember being, 16 years old and just thinking to myself, God, how is this possible? How is this man so incontinent? Like, why would he put the rest of us at risk? So the sheriff sergeant looks at my dad and he says, are you going to wait until he cracks somebody's skull open?
Mm.
And then he says, nope, he's not allowed at your home right now. And that was a defining moment for me, because that was the first time that I think I saw a man really step in and do something manly, right? About John and his situation, and to draw a hard line and to say this will not be tolerated no matter what. There weren't any, mushy sentiments about it. It was, this is wrong. It's not going to happen on my watch. And that's the end of it, right? So that's kind of the story there. And John would come variously in and out of the home for the next 10, 15, 20 years. He'd go overseas, he'd have a child, use that to manipulate his way back. My parents would promise he was never to come back. He'd still come back. And because me and my younger brother were always kind of de facto tasked, as long as we lived with our parents over that time, of sort of protecting everyone else from John's madness, I think that for me was kind of the big impetus towards, doing things like working security jobs, working as a bouncer, trying with the army, and also wanting to serve first responders, right? Because, I knew what it was like to stand up for, what was right, and to put my body on the line. Like, no one else was going to do it in that moment, right? And to put myself at risk and at risk of harm to protect, the people who I loved. And I knew what it was like to be kicked in the dick for doing so, right? To not experience any kind of gratitude or thanks, but to be literally hamstrung, right? So yeah, that's basically the John story. There's more to it than that, of course.
Yeah, but so so the prevalent line, the through thread that I hear along all of this is that other than saying, the manly thing to do, meaning the cop was like, yep, this is not going to happen on my watch. Yep, you were like, this is not, even at your age, even less, getting in between that and making that happen. And then what you're saying is getting in line to protect others. Some would say, yeah, a man's job is to provide and protect, right? I'm like, okay, sure, maybe if he's stronger and everything else, but
Sure,
quite frankly,
exactly.
most of my boyfriends would have shoved me out in front because I was more deadly than they were. But which is fine. But the other thing that comes into is these boundaries, this idea of boundaries, which sounds to me like the through thread that was lacking, especially in that. So how do you think this lack of boundaries, especially related to men, like if men are not growing up with understanding boundaries, what happens?
Lots of bad things, obviously, right? And I think that's really important, right? The level of aggressive arousal that a man is capable of inherently versus most women, I would say, right, on account of that heightened level of testosterone, on account of that biological difference, is for many men a lot higher, right?
Yeah.
A lot higher. And beyond that, there are also, these sort of social cultural questions of like, what makes me a man? What defines a man? Like, how do I know that I'm a man? And I think we see a lot of these young men who do these horrific things, like the mass and school shootings and whatnot. They're trying to assert their manhood, right? And if you listen to the stories and the narratives that come behind it, they all imagine that they're on some kind of like almost divine mission or something along those lines, right? They imagine that they're doing something that is protective of, whether there's a racist motivation, which there often is, or whether there's, some other kind of motivation that involves, claiming one's stake or defining one's territory or asserting oneself, right? And so, that question of a lack of boundaries, a lack of healthy or sensible or wise boundaries, I think that plays hugely into this, because what I think is happening from what I see is a lot of these young men, they're affected in kind of the same way I was, which is they're exposed to either domestic or familial violence. They have that imprint, right? Which makes them feel miserable about themselves, right? Human beings are like sponges, right? Like everything in nature, we imitate what's around us.
Yeah.
So should it be any surprise that, so many of these school and mass shooters and these guys who are failures to launch, in the less extreme examples, there's so many men who aren't going to ever, commit a mass killing, who lead lives of quiet desperation, drugs addiction, substance abuse, settling for just watching porn and that kind of thing, and not pursuing relationships with women or partners even of the same sex, if that's their orientation. So many men are so stunted. And when we look at the data, I think it's pretty overwhelmingly clear that there is a causality here. And a lot of it surrounds like, okay, like these guys came from broken homes, right? These guys had a bad influence, from the beginning. They were confronted with abuse, with aggression, with violence themselves, right? Which is why they feel so miserable, which is why they act these sorts of things out.
And it leads me to think about, like, a lot of people will stay in relationships. I'll hear women and men say that they're staying in relationships for the kids. And yet their relationships are toxic. Their relationships have abuse and violence, emotional abuse, physical abuse, other things. And somehow this idea of the family bond is more important than that mimicry. You know, like I'm writing a book called Uncoupling Love. And one of the things that I'm saying in there is we use love, the romance Hollywood version of love. Love is the most important thing ever. So people will say, I'm staying because I love them, which is like totally ridiculous. So if you're being emotionally and physically abused, that's a dumbass reason.
Yeah.
What I'm really seeing in this here is the, you know, if men have the inherent nature of volatility, and that doesn't mean it's bad. Volatility isn't bad. It's what you do with volatility, right? So if you've got that heightened sense, the startle reflex, the testosterone that gives you more like action-oriented need to take this out, and you internalize that instead of finding a healthy venue for it, that's when you blow up. And that's when these crazy kind of things happen, is that turning that, all that energy, let's just call it energy. Yeah. All that energy internal versus external. So we've got internal men blowing, you know, addiction, self-hatred, loathing. And then we've got external, you know, beating people, doing, you know, much more aggressive things like that, taking it out on people. But where the balance, and that's where I think we get back to the dance and the weapons. I think the balance is having that healthy male counterpart and female, whether it's biological or whatever. If you're raised by two people that have a balance of masculine and feminine, that all women and boys and girls can emulate, seeing that balance, that healthy balance back and forth, that's probably where you learn some of those skills, and learn how to dance before they hand you a weapon.
Absolutely.
That's what it's kind of occurring to me. Because as a woman, if I have to single mom my parent or my kid, I have to usually have more masculine traits happening because I have to be in action of providing and everything else. Men who are single parenting their kids are in that, have to take care of everything too. So where does the other counterpart come in? And in your family dynamic, you were talking about your mom was kind of like, and your dad was watered down.
Yeah.
Not holding any boundaries.
Yeah.
So it's a curious thing, but boundaries, I think boundaries are incredibly important. And I think a lot of people lack those boundaries, including self boundaries, which is what we've been talking about. When you were talking about we were talking about the startle reflex and the urge to, I remember my partner had left a sock in the hallway. That's going to sound funny. And I said, you know, you've walked past that sock like 15 times and you haven't taken it back to the bedroom. What's going on? And he goes, well, it's not moving. And I'm like, what? And he goes, there's no danger. The sock is still. So he was trying to let me know how masculine and manly he really was, because he already assessed the sock is still, no danger is coming. Right. But if the sock had moved, then it would have been worthy to look at it and assess the danger.
That's hilarious.
And this is a man that every time we found that his aggravation level rose up when he had put his desk in the living room with his back to the hallway.
Interesting.
It was a constant low-level stressor that he hadn't identified, but I identified because he was blowing up and losing his shit a lot. And I was like, what is going on? And then I realized, and so we changed the configuration and he settled right down. So that low-level stress of things moving back there, not the sock clearly, but other things were keyed in. All right. So from this idea of energy, so let's tag into that, this idea of the energy that men can inherently carry. And I think that is, it's biological, right? And it's cultural and it's societal. Like, are all men aggro? No, I've lived all over the world. It's actually a little bit more Western, because even in cultures where men are macho, doesn't mean macho equals aggression, but I see that happening way more in Western societies.
Sure.
And I don't know if your data or if that correlates out, but that feels like a thing that I see more.
No, I mean, that makes perfect sense. Like, I mean, look at like, just look at American cinema and think about like all these sort of like action hero movies. where, you know, you there's this depiction of this like lone male wolf who just like has to render some fantastic act of violence against, you know, a horde of enemies, right? And or even something like the structure of the first person shooter, you know, like starting with Wolfenstein 3D, the first one that came out. It's like, you know, you're the lone United States operative against a
Right.
castle of Nazis, and like
That's
it's
right.
so I think this fantasy is like deeply ingrained in the Western male psyche of like me kill many people in some heroic kind of effort, right? Um,
I think it's all because men can't have enough sex with women. I mean, well, you know, the idea of shooting multiple things, like, could this be actually evolutionarily entrenched that if men aren't mating with multiple women out in the world, like in the wild, it would be, right? Taking on them, that they're now shooting their other, you know, their one weapon is shooting blanks. Now what they've got to like take out everybody else. I don't know. The incels would be a perfect example of those guys who go whack-a-doodle and run cars into people because they're thinking women don't accept them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and that's, I mean,
yeah, that's an entirely different difference. And I've actually interviewed a few of them too, because I was interested to find out, like, what's really going on? You're in high school, you're 15, and you think no woman will ever accept you again. Did you know that high school is like the most horrible experience for most guys and women? You know, that's your data. 2 women turned you down. That's it. You're done. Yeah. Okay. So given this energy equation, what kind of things do we think we could have the men listening to this kind of contemplate? I would think I would want to leave guys with going, all right, so if the masculine and feminine in you, and this is not a new topic for a lot of the guys who listen to this show, but if the masculine and feminine in you, like the perfect balance is actually both, because the tree is strong and it bends with the wind, right? So like it's in nature gives us this as truth, not just some spiritual woo-woo kind of stance, but in nature, there is that balance. It just happens. And if you were raised, you know, primarily one or the other, or you're not embracing one or the other, and you have this energetic equation of testosterone, manhood, whatever you want to call it, sperm backed up, blue balls, it's all the same thing, right? Sure. I mean, this is literally the expression of blue balls being like aggravated and, you know, spewing out this energy either in the sock or against other people, right? Whatever it's doing here. But so I'd like the men to contemplate, like, are they pushing away an inherently important part of themselves, that more feminine aspect, the empty space you talked about, the space that holds the container versus pushing into the container, right? Are they actually pushing that away? Are you pushing that away consciously because you're worried about not being manly enough? So you're only wanting to hold the weapon without learning how to dance. And what that could be, what that shows up in your life like. Are you short-tempered? Are you critical? Are you judgmental? Are you ready for a fight? Are you constantly frustrated? You know, do your blue balls literally run your life? Sure. Is what I'd like the guys to think about, and you know, think about it, meditate, write about it, whatever. Ask the question of yourself, you know, do you feel like you're chronically blue balled and everything's about ready to explode and you just don't know where to aim that sucker, versus actually like embracing the other side of you, which could be gentle and conscious and okay with emptiness, and not always driving, not always having to prove something, not always in that space of direct force action. Does that scare you if you were to embrace both? Because the most manly men I know actually do. They are both of those things. So what are you thinking about that? What would you like the guys that listen to this think about?
I like your perspective on it. And I think, yeah, it's a big question about balance, right? And I think when we look at the narratives that lead so many men down this path, whether it's the extreme path of lashing out violently, these narratives are a response to some absence, to some fault. The shooter who took out these 12 innocent people at the Borderline Bar and Grill, the country bar that I worked at in Thousand Oaks. He it was like a single parent household, and it was a single mom, right? And so there wasn't someone there, right? It sounds like, to say no, right? To set those hard boundaries, to discipline, or to establish guide rails for that energy, that aggression. And I think what happens in these cases where there is something lacking, like as in the case with my brother and my dad also not being able to say no, men need to find a way to reparent themselves, right? Men need to find a way to console themselves, to not imagine, and because one of the most pernicious things about this incel ideology is this idea that I am worthless because the women don't like me. Who the fuck came up with that idea? You have no idea why, Betty Sue in one case doesn't like you, right? You can think about it, and she can tell you, and she may not even know, right? You're not even sure, right? It's an easy trap to fall into, though, where people guys will internalize this sense of worthlessness or shame because of other people's opinions or what's going on outside of them, or because they lack something essential in their lives, right? Like that kind of male guidance. So the question becomes what do we do about it? And to me, that's all about learning to soothe yourself, learning to coach yourself, learning to discipline yourself, learning to provide all those things for yourself that you're not getting from whoever was supposed to, or whoever you wanted to give it to you.
So that sounds like take a little journey to identify where you're feeling lack. Take that moment and reflect on what was lacking. Do you still have anger about your mom or your dad or some girl that didn't give it to you, or whatever is happening? So take that reflection and take a moment and think about that, write about it, bullet point it, whatever it is, and ask yourself what's missing. And then we're going to get into some of the how to create those self-soothing, how to coach yourself. We're going to do that, jump in the next one and talk a little bit about that. So we will see you again. Or we're not see you. You'll hear from us because we're not hearing you. Just saying.